Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today to this webinar about developing long-term STEM pipeline security, taking an early interventionist approach that Paula Walshe is going to give us. She's one of the experts of thematic working group 1 related to encouraging ICT education for girls and women. Paula Walshe is an early childhood education lecturer at South East Technological University in Cardiff, Ireland. She's also a PhD candidate. Her research is about STEM and early childhood education in Dundalk Institute of Technology. And I'm very proud of that. She's one of the members, one of the experts of Thematic Working Group 1, Encouraging ICT Education. Paula, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you very much for your time and for the presentation you are going to provide us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ruth. And I'm delighted to get the opportunity to present to you all today on our proposals and on our ideas and on my outputs in terms of the thematic working group. And also, so what we're talking about today is to develop how we can develop long-term STEM pipeline security and doing that using an early interventionist approach. So I won't reintroduce myself as Ruth said. But in terms of me in Ireland, this is Ireland, and this is where the red part is County Carlow. That is in the southeast is where I'm located, and where my the Southeast Technological University is as well. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you all about today is firstly just to I know you all are very well aware of all of this, but just to locate ourselves in the topic, just a very brief sort of look in terms of the current STEM policy landscape in Europe and where early childhood education sits in that, and then looking at the existing gaps in STEM pathways and pipelines. And I'm going to do that using the example of the Ireland country spotlight from the Women in Digital Index. Then I'm going to move on to propose how we can address the gap in early childhood or in STEM, ICT and digital for women by looking at STEM innovation in early childhood. Then we're going to look at how we can monitor that progress, how we will do it, and how then we can monitor how effective it could be, it will be, and monitoring the progress using one of our outputs from our thematic working group called the Early Childhood Education Classroom Evidence Lab, and then some suggested next steps where we go from here. So in terms of the policy landscape, the European STEM policy landscape, we know we have the EU Union of Skills, which talks about digital literacy being a skill for life, but also acknowledges that it's lacking in young people. We have the STEM Education Strategic Plan in the EU, which also focuses on the need for a long-term STEM education strategy. And I think that's something that's really important for us to focus on because, there are no quick fixes. There's no silver bullet. So we need to take, if we want to embed ICT, digital skills along the STEM pathways in education and on into digital careers for women, then we need to take a long-term, longitudinal approach to embedding those skills early on. The EU Digital Education Action Plan focuses on, or has a mention of digital skills and digital competence, and they've been acknowledged as being fundamental basic skills, so highlighting their importance alongside literacy and numeracy and active citizenship as skills which we all need right across our lifetime. And then we have tools and strategies like the DigComp Ed 2.2 framework, which is a framework to help support competence, educator competence from early childhood through to higher education and adult education. So, there's clearly a lot of focus on this area and the importance of the digital skills and ICT and STEM skills right across the lifespan, starting in early years. It is acknowledged within the European STEM policy landscape, but what are we doing about it? We're not really doing that much about it right now, which is something that we're proposing to address. So if we take a look at the Ireland context, so with the data from the Women in Digital Index from Ireland, and on the left-hand side here are the four pillars from the Women in Digital Index, which looks at STEM education of girls in primary and secondary, then moving into ICT areas in higher and vocational ICT programs, then graduating out on into early digital roles, and then moving on, hopefully up into leadership roles. And different countries will identify their leakage within this pathway and this pipeline at different stages. But in the Women in Index data for Ireland, it's identified a clear pipeline leakage occurring between the STEM education pillar with a score of 73.7, and it drops by just over 10% between the STEM pillar in primary and secondary through onto the ICT pillar in higher and vocational ICT programs. So this indicates that strong STEM engagement during primary and secondary education is not converting into ICT enrolment in higher and vocational education ICT programs. But the Women in Digital Index data for Ireland shows that once women then enter ICT education, so once we get them to that point, the progression into digital employment and leadership is strong with no further significant leakage indicated. So in Ireland, this is the source of our leakage in the STEM pipeline, according to that data, with that 10% leakage from girls moving from STEM in primary and secondary through to ICT at higher education and vocational education level. So there's lots of current STEM education policy in Ireland reflecting and building upon, the European context. So we have our STEM education policy, and that talks about STEM being in education from early childhood through to primary and secondary. However, a government report in 2022, so the initial policy was published in 2017, and implementation plans for that STEM policy and education policy are ongoing. However, in 2022, a Government of Ireland report told us that in early childhood education sector, the skills gap for STEM across the early childhood education sector is significant, and that gap needs to be addressed so that educators in early childhood and then subsequently, children can participate equitably in STEM education policy in the country. So the government have acknowledged that there's a significant gap in educators' STEM skills in Ireland. In 2026, then, something that was a piece of research that was published by the ERSI here in Ireland. Now, it didn't focus specifically on early childhood education, but what it was focusing on was digital skills in women in the workplace. And it highlighted a significant divide in digital skills in the workplace here in Ireland, and that women, even when they have digital skills, aren't advanced digital skills, aren't using them in the workplace. And that, even though that research doesn't focus specifically on early childhood education, it focuses across, a landscape of different sectors here. I think it's important when we consider what that research says about women not using advanced digital skills in the workplace, even when they have them. Because when we look at the early childhood education workforce here in Ireland, 96% of that workforce is female. So what that's telling us is that we've a hugely predominantly almost complete female-led workforce in the early childhood education sector. The government has acknowledged that there's a significant skills gap there in terms of STEM skills in the early childhood education workforce. And also research is showing us that generally across Ireland, in all work areas, that even when women have advanced digital skills, they're not using them. So there's sort of a double whammy affecting the early childhood education workforce there. In my own PhD research, I acknowledge there was a findings, in relation to the educator, obviously as a gatekeeper to what happens in the early childhood education classroom. So if there's a significant skills gap, and if there are issues with women using advanced STEM skills in their workplace, and we know that it's early childhood education is predominantly female led, then if we also consider that in terms of the educator being a gatekeeper to what happens in a pedagogical sense in the early childhood classroom, well, then it reduces, the likelihood of any kind of STEM or ICT learning opportunities making their way into the early childhood classroom for children. So in my own research, I developed a framework and also developed and rolled out and evaluated the impact of a STEAM training CPD intervention for early childhood educators, which was had favourable and positive results in terms of its impact on educators' ability to close that skills gap and to support educators to build their STEM skills and bring STEM into their early childhood practice. So just going back then to the gap, that 10% gap that was recognised in the Women in Digital Index. So the 10% STEM pipeline leakage here in Ireland happening between the transition from primary and secondary STEM education into higher and vocational ICT programmes. Well, what I'm sort of proposing here today is that we need to place a significant amount of thought into considering what's happening here in this space before that pillar, before this pillar around STEM engagement of girls in primary and secondary education. So what's happening before that pillar is that's the space where early childhood education sits. And we know in early childhood education that children go through accelerated brain development. Their brains develop faster during that time of life than any other time of life again. We also know through research such as the preschool, high school or high school project, for example, and other more contemporary research, that experiences which children have in terms of quality early childhood education, so pre-primary education, is proven to have a longitudinal impact on educational outcomes and social outcomes, and is also proven to have a longitudinal impact in terms of career choice. So what happens in that space is very important and could be a key to unlocking, the issues that we have in terms of STEM pipeline leakage. Also, research shows us that development of gender stereotypes begin to form in the early childhood education period of life. So, if we consider all these things together, it would seem evident and clear that we need to be focusing on early STEM innovation if we are to make an impact right across the STEM pipeline and to support more participation of women in STEM, ICT, digital and leadership skills right across the continuum. So as a result of that, one of the recommendations that we have made in the Women in Digital Thematic Working Group 1, one of the recommendations we have made for the next update to the EU Women in Digital Declaration is to prioritise early and sustained hands-on exposure to ICT skills. So what would that entail? What that would entail would be building early childhood educator skill and confidence by providing resources, CPD, micro-credentials, and embed STEM and ICT into initial teacher education programmes. Also to look at breaking down gateway barriers to STEM and ICT in early childhood education practice, including, as I found in my own research, that the willingness and ability. So, the skills transfer is not enough. CPD to give educators knowledge and skill of how to bring STEAM and STEM into their practice is insufficient unless we also give them the confidence and therefore support their willingness to embrace this new pedagogical approach. So we need to focus on skills transfer, but we also need to focus on developing their confidence and their willingness and their ability to see the relevance and why it's so important, so that when they do gain a further training in CPD, that they have the confidence and the willingness to bring it into their practice. Prior to my own research, there were a couple of other interesting studies which implemented STEM CPD programs for early childhood educators. But what they found afterwards was that, you know, the educators found the training really interesting, but when they went back to them, they found that they didn't actually implement anything they'd learned in practice. So that was a significant gap that I focused on in my own research and was able to address successfully in my research through the development of my own of my conceptual framework and CPD training program, which focused on supporting the willingness and the confidence to bring STEM into their practice, as well as the ability in terms of skills acquisition. Okay, and then after we build our education, the educator's skill and confidence, that will support them to embed STEM and ICT in their early childhood education pedagogical practice. It will also help to tackle gender stereotypes before they become embedded. And it will help us then to take a longitudinal approach to female participation in STEM and ICT across the lifespan. So how would we monitor that? You know, well, one of the outputs that we created as part of our thematic working group 1 was the Early Childhood Education Classroom Evidence Lab, an evidence to action cycle. And this would be to allow us to track participation of girls across the lifespan, beginning in early childhood, and feed that evidence forward to view it and to analyse it alongside evidence at primary, secondary, third level, and, you know, into the career stage, to assess the impact and to see the impact that an early intervention approach on STEM beginning in early childhood would have. So so to feed that evidence forward, as I said, to assess the impact on STEM pathway leakage. And I'm just going to briefly go through with you what that evidence to action cycle looks like, and then I'll go into it in a little bit more detail. So what we have in this evidence lab would be that at the start and the end of term, the early childhood educator would complete a short educator confidence survey. So assessing their own confidence in terms of bringing ICT, STEM and digital skills into their early childhood practice. Then they would also engage in a short audit, gender inclusive STEM, ICT and digital resources classroom audit, to look at gender inclusion and gender representation in terms of promoting STEM and STEM role models and STEM resources that are gender inclusive and gender neutral in their classroom. Then at the end of term, they would do a very brief STEM ICT digital engagement record by observing children and noting the interest and engagement among girls in the STEM ICT and digital resources. And then there's a short reflection where the educator would reflect on what's happened in their classroom over the term. And then there was a 2-page aggregated report that the setting or the school itself could use to identify perhaps skills or CPD gaps and bring that forward with them into the following term to make further improvements. And what we would hope then that the next time they start the cycle in the next school year, that the educator confidence survey would produce higher rates of confidence on the scale than the previous year. But also our proposal also states that we would that there needs to be also accompanying supporting resources and tip sheets and CPD training and perhaps micro credentials specific to early childhood education pedagogical practice, which would accompany the early childhood education classroom evidence lab to support educators to build their skill. So I'm going to take you through now just each step of what the classroom evidence lab, the early childhood education classroom evidence lab would look like. So the first step, as I said, was the confidence survey at the start of the year. And they would also repeat it at the end of the year. So you would hopefully see an improvement at the end of the year in comparison to the start of the year. And it's used to detect trends in early childhood educator confidence, belonging and motivation to incorporate STEM, ICT and digital tools over time, and to support reflective teaching practice rather than formal evaluation. So it begins with some administrative information, and then it moves into, and I have the questions included in the image on the right. So it's a simple Likert scale where the educator looks over this very brief survey and just ticks the box in how they feel in terms of their confidence and competence to incorporate digital tools, STEM and STEM and digital tools into their pedagogical practice, and how confident they feel and whether they would like to continue to improve it in the future. So there's 6 questions there, and then that score would be tallied up, and then they would do the same confidence survey at the end of the year and compare. So the next part of the lab would be a survey which they would also take at the start of the year, a gender inclusive STEM, ICT and digital resources early childhood classroom audit. So this would capture evidence of gender equity in terms of access to STEM, ICT tools and digital resources in the early childhood education classroom. So it gets the teacher to reflectively sort of think about the resources and the provision of resources in their classroom. And it's used to support, again, reflective teaching practice rather than formal evaluation. So again, you can see the questions, Likert scale questions on the right-hand side. So they're considering on the scale if their classroom includes ICT resources, if it includes digital tools with screens, digital tools without screens, if it includes a variety of STEM resources, if the educator thinks that the STEM, ICT tools and digital resources in their classroom are gender neutral in terms of colour and of imagery, for example. It asks the educator to think about their use of gender inclusive language. Are they avoiding associating certain toys or resources and activities as specific to only boys or girls? So for example, if there's a dress up area, are they there's a firefighter outfit, do they say firefighter or fireman? Do they say police officer or policeman? You know, simple things like that, thinking about the color pink and blue and the subconscious sort of bias that can introduce. Do they intentionally use STEM terminology with children of all genders in the classroom? For example, we are engineers or scientists or researcher, or let's explore, or any kind of STEM terminology. Do they think their classroom includes imagery of girls in STEM roles and girls in STEM roles and female STEM role models? Does their classroom include books depicting girls in STEM roles and female STEM role models? And are all the STEM and ICT resources and digital tools in their classroom fully accessible to all children, regardless of gender, disability and learning need? So the next step in the early childhood classroom evidence lab would be a simple observation that the educator would take part in on a given day at the end of term to track early childhood education, STEM, ICT and digital engagement among girls in the room. So it would record an intentional observation to specifically note girls' engagement in STEM, ICT tools and digital resources in their classroom through a snapshot type of observation. The data supports longitudinal analysis of girls' interest and participation in STEM, ICT tools and digital resources linked to longitudinal retention trends. So it would give us microdata in terms of specifically girls' interest and engagement based on the observations of the educator. And what we would hope then is over the course of a number of years and terms that as educators engage in the evidence lab cycle and consider their practice and consider the inclusion of resources and engage in associated training and CPD and look at the tip sheets and things like that, that we would see an increase over time, and that can then feed forward into data at primary, higher education and on into the workforce and beyond, and help us to tackle that fall off in the STEM pathways. So it's very simple observation record. So there's no determined number of minutes here because that hasn't been decided, and that's something that we will engage with when we go to trial this tool in an educational setting. But a snapshot observation, I know from my own training, would usually be something like 10 minutes. So 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes at midday, 10 minutes in the afternoon, for example, to look around the room and count the number of girls in the classroom, the number of girls at any one time using STEM, ICT and digital resources, and then one or two written notes from the educator. So that would help us then to work out a progression rate calculator in terms of girls' STEM, ICT and digital progression rate as a percentage, and that we would calculate that as the number of girls engaging with the resources across the course of the day, divided by the total numbers of girls initially enrolled, multiplied by 100, and that would give us our progression rate calculation. Also, in terms of contextual notes, the teacher might note something like, perhaps there was the introduction of new resources, materials, and activities that they correlate with this change and this progression, or a curriculum change, or maybe they engaged in a targeted STEM or ICT intervention, or maybe there were timetabling or staffing changes that either increased or decreased the result, and it would allow us to take that data into consideration. And then at the end of term, then the educator would engage in a mini reflection, and this mini reflection form, and I think you can see probably from what the different questionnaires or survey questions at each stage, they're light touch, they're short, they're meant to be as low impact on the educator as possible, to increase the likelihood of their participation and engagement, and not to detract from what they're doing in the classroom. So they're sort of light touch indicators along the way. So this would be just a mini reflection at the end. And what would help the educator in terms of it being a structured reflection on classroom dynamics related to confidence, participation and inclusion in STEM, ICT or digital learning. And it would complement the quantitative classroom data from the other indicators from the evidence lab, and focus on learning and improvement. And it would be completed at the end of the term. So these are the questions that it would ask the educator to reflect on in terms of, firstly, curriculum planning and the learning environment. How did I plan for the incorporation of STEM, ICT tools and digital resources this term? Question 2, the role distribution and classroom dynamics. What did I notice about the children's engagement with STEM, ICT tools and digital resources this term? What patterns stood out? Question 3, teaching adjustments and strategies. What specific teaching choices or adjustments improved access to or engagement with STEM, ICT tools and digital resources? So it's the teacher's reflections, recording and reflecting back on what they did that worked or didn't work, what they could improve on, or what maybe they could change, or what worked really well that they can bring forward. So some examples of what might come under this question would be maybe in terms of teaching choices or adjustments. Maybe was their intentional use of STEM language with children, new resources and materials. Maybe that term they had a visit from a female STEM role model. Maybe the educator joined a STEM community of practice, engaged in CPD, or used existing resources in a new way to promote STEM, ICT and digital engagement. So they're just some prompts, they could have more of their own, but it's just to give them an idea of the kinds of things that they might consider that they might have done or changed that year. And then in terms of a forward-looking reflection, there's one sort of question 4. What is one concrete example of something you would do differently next term to make ICT tools and digital or STEM resources and activities more gender inclusive and accessible? And then question 5, there's an optional summary statement. So in one sentence, how would you describe the main inclusion-related learning from this term? So it's getting the educator to reflect over the course of the year from where they started, what they did, what they changed, what went well, or what needs to be adjusted going forward, and really make this a valuable tool to support the incorporation of STEM and ICT into their pedagogical practice with young children. So then, in terms of how that can feed forward and how into the school board, for example, so there's a summary sheet or an aggregated report. So this would be a short 2 to 3 page report generated at the end of the term based on the aggregated ECE classroom level data collected through the Early Childhood Education Classroom Evidence Lab. And it would reflect trends and patterns, not individual performance or causal impact. So it's not intended to be used as, a performance monitor in terms of the educators. It's intended as a tool to improve practice across the school community, to feed forward into policy, and for them to be able to take, a whole school approach and to identify trends and patterns. So the summary report, so it would provide a brief 2 or 3 page aggregated summary of the key indicators which were captured at early childhood education classroom level through the Early Childhood Education Classroom Evidence Lab throughout the year. It would help to inform planning at school level because it would reflect trends and patterns, not individual performance or causal impact, and it would help to inform future planning and practice at school or board level. And it would help to bridge policy and practice. So it can feed forward micro-level data generated through the Early Childhood Education Classroom Evidence Lab to inform policy at both national level and EU level. So we've also developed, as part of, to accompany our initial Early Childhood Education Classroom Evidence Lab, 2 tip sheets for educators to help them get started. So in tip sheet 1, we provide a list of suggested materials and resources to help early childhood educators integrate ICT, STEM and digital resources in their classroom. So, for example, lists of digital screen-based tools, digital tools without screens, unplugged and other resources to support interest in STEM careers and which can promote digital competence, and also a suggested list of children's books which promote girls in STEM. We have tip sheet 2 then to accompany the lab, which provides examples of STEM language which educators can use with early childhood education children to support intentional STEM interactions, extend children's interest in STEM and foster STEM engagement in the early childhood education classroom. And we also provide a list of female STEM role models related to each individual STEM field. So these tip sheets are intended to be a starter sort of resource and support for educators to support them to the first time they begin to engage in the evidence lab, they can then draw upon these resources to improve. So that's the Early Childhood Education Evidence Lab that we propose to support using in early childhood education to help bridge that gap and stem the leaky STEM pathways that we've identified in the Women in Digital Index data. But why does all of this matter then for policy and policymakers? Well, it operationalises gender equality because we're going to be implementing gender equality principles in STEM and ICT education intentionally at early childhood education level, which is a change to what is currently happening. We can generate micro-evidence by collecting small pieces of evidence from early childhood education classroom activities, and then we can connect with policy and practice by bridging the gap between educational policies and classroom implementation, again with a specific intentional focus on early childhood education as a key time, which is acknowledged in European policy as important for developing STEM skills, but yet when we look at practice, it's not what's happening. So we need to, make that change. And that's what we're proposing in terms of this evidence lab and the supports. So bringing us back then, just to come full circle in terms of addressing the gap through early STEM innovation. So bringing you back then to the 4 pillars of the Women in Digital Index and highlighting the 10% STEM leakage in Ireland happening between the first 2 pillars. But even if in another country the STEM pipeline leakage happens between any of the other pillars, it's not going to be necessarily in the same spot as Ireland. But because the early childhood education education sector is at the very beginning, and we know that it has longitudinal positive impacts across the lifespan, regardless of where the leakages are in the STEM pipeline, it makes sense to focus and place an increasing focus on supporting early ICT and STEM skills to children in pre-primary education, because that will impact them going forward right throughout the continuum. Okay, so early STEM and ICT. If we place a focus on it, if we bring recommendations into our Women in Digital Declaration to place that increased focus on early and sustained hands-on engagement with STEM and ICT, if we roll out the Early Childhood Education Evidence Lab and gather that micro data and support it with resources and training for early childhood educators, then we'll end up with trained early childhood educators. Gender responsive STEM and ICT will become embedded in early childhood education pedagogy. We'll be able to capture evidence of that using the Early Childhood Classroom Evidence Lab and track that then going forward across the continuum. And then also we'll have ongoing reflection through the evidence lab, which will result in ongoing improvements to practice. And all of that can feed forward and inform policy developments, as I said, at both national and EU level. And this will help us to assess the impact over time on STEM pipeline leakage. And so just to show you there, finally, just the connection between that early STEM right across the STEM pipeline. So I think, you know, it's an approach which we haven't focused on enough before, and hopefully I've convinced you all today the reason why we need to focus on it and the positive impact that can have for us all right across the STEM pipeline. So what are the next steps? Well, the next steps are that we need to take EU level action. So first of all, updating the Women in Digital Declaration and our thematic working group 1, we have proposed that a recommendation on early and sustained STEM or ICT engagement be included in the forthcoming updated Women in Digital Declaration going forward. Also, we then need to develop and make available early childhood education specific ICT and STEM micro credentials and resources. So, for example, you know, we could use the STEAM from the Start conceptual framework as an evidence base, because I have gathered research showing the positive impact on that in terms of developing a CPD for early childhood education, which had positive outcomes in terms of long-term impact on increasing STEM in early childhood education pedagogy. And then we can use the early childhood classroom evidence lab to gather evidence and feed that forward. So that's just my references there for you. And thank you very much for listening. And
Thank you very much.
Back over to you, Ruth.
Yes, thank you very much, Paula. Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm sure that everybody enjoyed it and pay a lot of attention. And if there is any question, please feel free to raise your hand and I will give you the floor. Otherwise, I will take the micro because I have a couple of questions for Paula, even though she's in my thematic working group, you know? No? Okay, great. Paula, yeah, your research, because you know, I have plenty of time to know you, so I checked about you, and your research shows that willingness is often a bigger barrier for teachers than their actual skill level. If a teacher is anxious about math or science, what is the first small step they should take to start using your framework? As an example,
Yeah. Well, I think there's a few things. And also, it's important for us, first of all, to think about that when we're talking about STEM and the STEM education phase, we're not talking about the individual elements. So we're not talking about maths on its own and science on its own, because teachers, that's not where the teachers are having issues with their confidence, with their willingness. Where they're having those issues is in terms of considering the hands-on approach, because that's what STEM is. It's an approach that brings together the learning in maths, science, technology, engineering. So when if we're talking about STEM and STEM education and a STEM approach and early and sustained hands-on, we're talking about educators lacking that willingness and ability and confidence to be able to implement that part, the hands-on doing of STEM activities using the maths knowledge that they have. So having the maths knowledge and bringing the maths in is not an issue. It's doing that through STEM, and how to do that is an issue, is where the issue lies. And part of that, in my framework, there's like 6 phases, but part of that is, first of all, through training and resources, understanding the importance, the why of they should be doing this. Why is this important? If I'm already teaching them maths and I'm already teaching them science, why is STEM important? Is one thing. And so as I said, the training, the willingness, things like a different approach to what they might have considered barriers before. Because a lot of the time, educators think that to bring STEM or digital resources into their environment, there's going to be an expense and an outlay. So reconsidering that and focusing on how can we bring STEM into our pedagogical practice using the resources that we already have and building from there. So what my advice to educators in terms of willingness would be, first of all, to seek out resources, but also to understand why we need to be doing this. It's not just because it's popular, it's because it's embedded within most curriculums, and it's embedded within EU curriculum strategy, and also because of the benefit. If we don't empower children with these skills in early childhood or at any other stage, well, then we're not providing them with the skills that we've been told that they need as lifelong skills, fundamental basic skills to engage in the world, in which, as we can see from the EU Union of Skills, for example, includes digital literacy and digital competence.
Okay, it's funny because today, did you finish, Paula? Yeah,
I did.
Well, yeah, sorry. I wanted to just share with you that today I have a conversation with one of the teachers at University Politécnica de Catalunya, where I am now. And yeah, it's funny because he told me that he was saying to their children, I don't remember, boy, girl, I think one of them is a girl, to study mathematics. That mathematics is the language of the world. And even though now we are very worried for our jobs regarding artificial intelligence and so on, he was telling this. And that is related to another question that I want to ask you, is regarding what the parents can do with your tool, if there is something, because that teachers complain about the burden they already have, no? So there is something that teachers, families can do, can use your tool, or what will be your recommendations to parents that are very sensitive to this for their children, how they can educate or encourage? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, the tool I developed through my research is intended to be used as a framework to develop training for educators. So not necessarily for the educators to use the tool themselves. It's intended to be used by those who develop training, CPD and training courses on STEM for educators. But one huge thing that I think is important is in terms of the language, and STEM language, because the STEM language that we can bring STEM language in very easily and cheaply, and it doesn't have to impede in any way that we do anything already. And also considering the resources that we have in our environment, do they support STEM? And also, are they gender inclusive in terms of, you know, the imagery and what they sort of, the unconscious message that it can send out in terms of who this is for and who it's not for, you know. So in terms of just, you know, to be honest and upfront, my tool is not intended to be used by educators themselves and parents. It's intended to be used to develop a training program which ultimately will make educators more willing and more able to bring STEM in and to recognize. So in my research, what I found was through the CPD that I developed based on my framework, educators recognized where STEM was already actually present in their practice that they hadn't recognized, and then where they could build on that. And that was sort of key to the long-term impact. So as I said to you at the start, there were some other research projects where STEM CPD was carried out with educators, but they never implemented even one single thing from the training in their classroom. When I went back to educators who engaged in my training, and I went back to a cohort of them at both 3 months after they engaged in the training and at 9 months after, they were still incorporating STEAM based on their engagement in the training. They were still incorporating it into their practice. So I think that's why the willingness and the ability are so important. Transfer of skills and knowledge is not enough if the educator doesn't have the willingness and the confidence to do it on their own when they go back into their classroom.
And Paula, another question that I have for you is related to this. Well, you say no that about the training. So I just wonder, you know that the Bitcoin report show that that very little European funding currently goes toward gender equality in digital transformation. So do you think the best use of future funding will be to make your STEAM from the start training mandatory for all early childhood educators? I know this is a challenge question, but feel free to answer, yes?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, I would love to see uptake of my research, you know, in educational policy and in the development of educational tools. Um, and I think, you know, the fact that it has an evidence base, and also the tool was developed with early childhood educators. So, you know, I went out and researched with early childhood educators, and used their feedback and used the findings to develop a framework. And then I used that framework to develop the training. So the training was in direct response to what early childhood educators here in Ireland were saying was stopping them or impeding them from bringing STEAM into their pedagogical practice with young children. So it was meeting their needs. You know, it was in direct response to their experience. And I think that that's a factor in the why there were the positive outcomes in terms of the long-term impact on their practice. But of course, I would love to see all educators have to take part in STEAM training as part of their initial educator training and for the provision of ongoing resources, because, you know, if we are talking at EU level about the importance of these skills in education, and we're talking about them in terms of the importance for participation in society and as fundamental basic skills, then we need to consider when is the period of time that the most impact can be made. There are many um, initiatives, wonderful initiatives promoting girls in STEM education that happen at primary and mainly at secondary level, yet we're still not making the progress that we need to make in terms of the impact on an increase in the percentage of women in STEM and women progressing to ICT and digital careers. So, you know, as I know I've said before, we can't keep doing the same thing and expect different results. So we need to look at an innovative approach. And to me, that makes sense to look at the time when gender stereotypes become embedded, when brains develop more than at any other time in our lives, and also at a time when educational policy says we need to bring STEM in, but has also recognised that there's a gap in training. So we need to do something about that, you know, and I hope that that's where my research can come in and make a difference.
Yeah, and you're right. And I believe it was Leonardo da Vinci who said you cannot expect the same results, different results doing the same thing, as you mentioned, no?
Yeah.
I believe he was. And yeah, jumping to some event that is going to happen this year, and it's more related to leadership. And we have here Simona as one of the listeners, participants. You know that the Woman on Words, the deadline is approaching and is going to be in June 2026. So I wonder, how can starting STEAM early help build the confidence girls? You more or less already answered, but maybe you can be more concrete regarding this topic, how your tool, your proposal can help build the confidence girls need to eventually reach these leadership positions in the technology sector, in your experience from your research approach. Yeah?
Yeah, well, considering the Women in Digital Index data, and for speaking in terms of the Irish data, and recognizing that, before girls are even reaching a third level, there's a fall off, a 10% fall off, which is quite significant, especially when the fall off after that is so minimal, is low. So that indicates straight away that the problem is happening before then. So, and I think we need to consider, as I said, there's research, very interesting research that shows, how girls at the not my research, and I don't have the name of the author in my head at the moment, but that did research with children, and girls as young as 5 were describing boys as really, really clever and not using the same language to describe themselves. So, and also we know from research, not my own research, but research of others, that those stereotypes are beginning in early childhood. So you're talking about by the time they're 6, girls are seeing themselves as not as clever as boys, and that for both boys and girls, gender stereotypes are becoming embedded. So if we bring those a focus on something that we know is linked to gender and gender stereotypes in early, well, then it means that for both boys and girls, it's going to challenge those embedded stereotypes. So it means that for girls, they're going to see themselves as more capable and confident because it's going to be embedded in them before stereotypes develop. And also for boys, it will hopefully challenge gender stereotypes and see them becoming, champions of women in STEM as well. And I think it's very important that we look at, regardless of STEM, that we look at the research, not my research, but the other research that has been done that's concrete research for like a long time now, that has highlighted the impact, the lifelong impact of quality early childhood education experiences on children. So therefore, whatever we do in early childhood education, it has a long-term impact. So I think when you consider everything, all the different factors, then it makes sense, so.
And Paula, finally,
But
if
we
there
need
is
the
not,
classroom evidence lab to gather that data then, so that's
yeah,
why we're proposing this we can see it makes sense from everywhere else, but from indicators, but we need to then use something like the early childhood education classroom evidence lab to prove it and to gather that evidence and then going forward.
well, this is related to my final question, if there is no more question. And Paula, it was a pleasure to make you the first interview that I did when I'm like chair in thematic working group 1 at the beginning, like almost 9 years ago. It was a really pleasure to meet you and have the interview. And and now after the time pass and I have this experience with you, I can say that you have contributed greatly to the thematic working group 1, and I public want to make that a sentence acknowledge to you. But I will also love to hear from you. I know from you already personally that maybe a short reflection what thematic working group 1, Woman in Digital Forum, Connecting Women in Digital has provided you, has helped you to support your research, and what is your experience regarding this this project. So it will be great to have, some shorter reflection in order to close. And yeah, Irina is here also, is listening, and I know that you with her have a very good team, complement each other, but I would love to hear something, so related to this in order to close this webinar. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm delighted to have gotten the opportunity to be involved in this thematic working group, so thank you for that. And I hope that some more initiatives come out of it going forward to allow me to be involved in some of the outputs in the future. But yeah, it's been a very enriching experience, especially as a researcher. But I'm very passionate about this area. You can probably tell, not only because of my research, but because I come from a practice background. So I was an early childhood educator on the ground. And I teach early childhood educators here at the university, and my research has focused on that. So I'm very it's something that's very important to me, but also regardless of my own personal sort of stuff, there's the fact that this area is so important going forward for everybody in terms of skill, and it's just been great for me to have the opportunity to engage in a platform that I haven't engaged in before, and to get that exposure in terms of my research, and to be able to make a contribution, which I hope I have. And hopefully it'll make an impact going forward. So I've really enjoyed it, and I've really enjoyed working with you and working with Irina and the rest of the group. And it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Paula. Thank you for this presentation, for your time, for your acknowledge, for your compromise to the thematic working group 1. Has been a pleasure to have you like an expert. It's funny because you mentioned champion word, and for me you are a champion. You, Irina, and a couple of more of experts.
You.
Yes, you already know that. So thank you everybody for joining us. We will have another couple of webinars with Paula regarding something that we are preparing, and we are very excited about that. And thank you for your time. Feel free to send us an email if you want more questions or you want to propose more webinars. We are here to do so. So have a nice afternoon and rest of the week. Bye.